Good morning. My name is Dr. Kyla Hingwing, and I'm a Research and Innovation Manager on the Health team at Genome BC. Thank you for joining us for this session entitled Unlocking Hope, From Gene Editing to Immune Revolution. The implementation of CAR T-cell therapy as a standard of care in British Columbia marks a significant advancement in cancer treatment accessibility for both pediatric and adult patients. In this session, we will explore the forefront of gene and immune engineering as it transforms precision medicine, offering new hope for patients with rare genetic conditions, autoimmune disease, and cancer. Joining me today are our esteemed panelists. Dr. Saad Kandirian is an assistant professor of medicine, immunology, and oncology with the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. Dr. Megan Levings is a professor in the Department of Surgery and School of Biomedical Engineering at the University of British Columbia and the Director of Childhood Diseases Theme at BC Children's Hospital Research Institute. She is also a Canada Research Chair in Engineered Immune Tolerance. Dr. Kevin Song is a clinical professor at the University of British Columbia and the medical director of the Leukemia Bone Marrow Transplant Program of British Columbia. And last but not least, we have Dr. Nathan Michaels, who holds a PhD in neuroimmunology from the University of Calgary and is the Director of Precision Medicine and Genetic Services at the BC Ministry of Health. Following our discussion, we'll have an interactive Q&A session with you, the audience, and we ask your questions at any time throughout the talk using the Q&A panel on the side of your screen. You can also upvote questions as they appear, and we'll use the most popular ones during the Q&A session. So let's dive into the topic at hand. Welcome to all my panelists. So let's start with exactly how CAR T technology works, and how does it use to combat disease? Dr. Kandirian, do you mind taking us to this question?
Yeah, sure. So CAR T technology, CAR T cells is an exciting technology. CAR T cells is a form of living therapy. It really is the first living therapy that's approved. And what we do is you take the patient's own T cells from the blood. So your patients will have a leukapheresis similar to blood donation. And then the T cells are isolated. And then T cells are sent to the lab. And they are engineered in a way to make them see cancer cells and to make them kill cancer cells. So for the audience, for the non-medical folks in the audience, the T cells are part of the immune cells that fight cancers and fight infection. And in cancer, the T cells have historically failed to kill cancer cells. And the purpose of CAR T cells therapy is to engineer the cells in a way to make them recognize cancer cells and to charge them in a way to make them more effective to kill cancer cells. So when the T cells are taken from patients, they are sent in the lab. Over a period of anywhere between 1 to 2 weeks, the T cells are engineered and then they are expanded. They are increased in numbers by several folds. And at the end, then the majority of the T cells become CAR T cells. And they are frozen and they are shipped back to the center, or if they are manufactured at the center, then they are given back to patients. And before CAR T cells are administered, then patients receive low-dose chemotherapy. And the purpose of this chemotherapy is really to kill the patient's own immune cells, to create room, if you wish, for the infused CAR T cells to see cancer cells, to go around and kill cancer cells. It creates a homeostatic environment, increases specific cytokines that help the CAR Ts to work. And then when CAR T cells are infused, then they go and locate cancer cells and they kill cancer cells. And during this time, as they are killing cancer cells, they are releasing their own cytokines and proteins to help kill cancer cells. And then patients are sick with what we call cytokine release syndrome. And then during that time is most killing of cancer cell happens. And then after they are done with killing cancer cells, then they contract, they decrease back in number. And in some cases, they stick around so they can prevent the cancer from coming back.
Thank you, Dr. Kandirian. Dr. Levings, you're also using CAR T or other immunoengineered technologies to fight other diseases. Could you elaborate on how this similar technology is used for other diseases? Dr. Megan, I think you're muted right now.
Oh, sorry. Oh, yes.
No problem.
Sorry. Yeah. So start again. Yeah. So my lab also works on CAR T cells, but a different kind of T cell, a regulatory T cell. And these cells have the opposite purposes of CAR T cells, and that's to turn off immune responses. Most of the time, we think about the immune system being against cancer, against infection, as we just heard. But actually, there's this parallel critical function to ensure that we don't respond to substances in the world and our own tissues that we really should not be mounting an immune response to. And so the cells that do that job are called regulatory T cells. So we can engineer them in exactly the same way that we just heard about for CAR T cells, genetically modifying them to change their function, so that we can enhance their ability to turn off immune responses. And what my lab is working on and other labs around the world is using that technology to turn off undesired immune responses in diseases like autoimmune diseases like diabetes or multiple sclerosis, as well as in the context of transplantation. So to improve outcomes of people who have an organ transplant or who undergo hematopoietic stem cell transplantation.
Great, thank you. So these are really innovative technologies, and I'm just curious of any success stories that you have experience with in utilizing these technologies, either in your own work or in others. Dr. Kandirian, do you want to start?
Yeah, certainly. What's exciting with this technology is that we see patients go in remission, in complete remission, in a deep complete remission that lasts, and it can last years after the therapy is given. The first patient we treated at the University of Pennsylvania is still in remission now. 12 years later, that patient had chronic lymphocytic leukemia. One story in mind is one of our first patients here at Mayo Clinic that we treated with a CD19 directed CAR T on a clinical trial, and that was in 2017. And the patient had chronic lymphocytic leukemia as well, and patient went in complete remission. And what's remarkable is with this patient is, has patient has gone through multiple lines of therapy before, and always we're waiting for the cancer to come back, and now he's in a deep complete remission. And really within a year after therapy, then you hear from patient that this is the first time that they feel back to their normal before the cancer diagnosis, in a way decades ago, that they haven't felt this way. So it's very gratifying to us, and it tells us that when this therapy works well, it's quite remarkable that can completely eradicate the tumor, and can make patients feel back to normal, to the time before they were diagnosed with cancer.
That's very hopeful. Dr. Levings, do you have any success stories you could share?
So the field of CAR Tregs is a very new field. So I would say we're probably about a decade behind where CAR T cells are. So the cells that I work on are just being tested now in patients. There's two first-in-human clinical trials happening in Europe, and we don't know the results yet. We expect to hear probably in about a year or so. But early evidence is that the cells are safe, which is great. Very important to establish with these new therapies. And hopefully in a year or so, we'll know if they're effective. Just another aspect to trying to use this type of therapy for autoimmunity and non-cancer related diseases. There's actually been a major transformation in the use of CAR T cells that we just heard about for cancer, to control autoimmunity. So the reason why CAR T cells directed against B cell cancers work is that they eliminate B cells, which are the immune cells in your body that make antibodies, and they can cause cancer, which is why CAR T cells were originally developed to kill those cancerous B cells. But you can also use those CAR T cells to kill B cells that are causing an autoimmune disease. And so now we have this huge transformation in a whole new application for the same cell type. With very exciting data in particular in lupus, where there's been several reports now out of Germany for patients similar to the cancer patients who had gone through multiple lines of therapy, basically failed all their treatments. They're at the end of the line, and then got a single injection of the CD19 directed CAR T cells, and were essentially cured of their lupus, which is incredible. So very exciting times.
It is exciting. So earlier this year, CAR T therapy for cancer has now been approved by the province. Dr. Kevin Song, how will this affect your cancer patients or cancer patients living in British Columbia?
So my group has been doing clinical trials in CAR T cell therapies since about 2017 as well. So we've had a lot of experience through these clinical trials and taking care of patients. And what has been really, really nice is that it's given us the experience such that by the time that we have standard of care CAR T cells, meaning CAR T cells that are outside of clinical trials, which we started earlier this year, the medical expertise and the institutional expertise is there. We're just trying to formalize the process. And so the era that we're in is really trying to expand to try to give all these treatments to the necessary people who have this, and of course try to build the capacity to continue to do this. So we're in a very exciting time where we're, like Dr. Kadarian, trying to push the boundaries of what we can do with cellular therapy.
So just to clarify for people that don't know or aren't familiar with CAR T cell therapy, which cancers are currently it's able to use for? I understand, I believe it's usually like blood cancers specifically that you can use CAR T for?
That's correct. Right now, the indications, meaning what the government of Canada has approved for therapy, are typically blood cancer. So the basic ones are aggressive lymphomas, acute lymphoblastic leukemias, and actually multiple myeloma. And right now, the BC government is funding for aggressive lymphomas and acute lymphoblastic leukemia. And the broader community, all the provinces are looking at funding for multiple myeloma, which will hopefully happen in the near future. So this is just the tip of the iceberg, as I had mentioned, because we'll be moving into other things in the future, I expect, similar to what Dr. Levings has mentioned regarding autoimmune disease and the like. And that's also an exciting area. But there is also research that is being done in other cancers that are not hematological. For instance, there are early research that is being done in solid tumor cancer. So things like prostate and the like, and germ cell tumors.
Yeah, and it's my understanding just through the science that the reason why the blood is more accessible is just that because the blood is all throughout the human body, that it doesn't need to be targeted to a specific area of the body. Is that why CAR T is more accessible for those cancers?
I think it goes back to probably one of the um, therapeutic pillars of hematological cancers, which is hematopoietic stem cell transplant. We've been doing cellular therapy really for a generation, but it's been a bit more crude in the sense that, we've just been giving high doses of chemotherapy, then using a donor in the hopes that the donor immune system will help get rid of the cancers that the recipient has. I think what CAR T cells is doing is refining that capability in terms of targeting the cancer much more directly. And hopefully also over time, we'll learn how to reduce the side effects such that people can tolerate this in a much more safer fashion. So I think that this is what CAR T cells are doing is pushing us to, as was mentioned previously, a living drug such that people can, get more directed therapy, which is more controllable.
Fabulous. So now that it has now been approved by the ministry, Dr. Michaels, how will this then be implemented into our current healthcare system such that it's standard of care?
That's a good question. I think it does. CAR T and gene therapies and other immunotherapies that kind of fall within that broader umbrella, they represent transformational new therapies, meaning that they either provide opportunities for treatment that are well beyond what is currently available as standard of care, or they're working in indications that previously had nothing available to these types of patients. So, and that's a great thing, and that's what is particularly exciting about working in this area of the healthcare system. And that's not to say it doesn't come without its challenges. Um, Therapies like these, it's not as simple as it used to be in previous times when you're talking about like small molecule type drugs or biologics. These are more than just a drug or a single treatment. These are entirely kind of new therapeutic paradigms, and it does require a lot of resources at the hospital level. We need specialized physicians to be able to provide these treatments, data coordinators, administrative staff, nurses, lab space, the supply chain, as was mentioned before, where these cells actually have to be taken out and shipped to a different country and come back. This does create a fair amount of complexity in being able to implement something like this. So the challenge is being that we have to plan far in advance to be able to make the accommodations within the healthcare system for the delivery of these therapies. But then the administrative and the regulatory and the drug review side also has to adapt. And that's kind of what we're seeing across the landscape in Canada, is how we're transitioning from what worked in the past to be able to accommodate these more transformational therapies, in that bodies like Health Canada is able to make quicker decisions based on different evidence than what you typically see for small molecule and biologic drugs. Same thing with the Canadian Drug Agency with time limit recommendations, and with the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance. All of these bodies are adapting their processes so that patients are given faster access to potential therapies that can provide them a ton of benefit over what was there before. So it's a really exciting time to be working in an area of the healthcare system that is making the changes required and is doing the work to be able to offer some really groundbreaking therapies to a lot of patients across the country.
Thank you. I think that's a really good point, because unlike a normal drug that you would just go to the pharmacy and fill your prescription, which we already have in place across the province, in this case now, like you said, there's a whole pipeline and a process, and there's also a lot of infrastructure that needs to be established around the implementation of that process. And so, Dr. Levings, it was recently announced that you've been granted a Canada Immunoengineering Hub grant to develop infrastructure for cellular therapies. And so will this project also help scale the manufacturing of these technologies?
Yes, absolutely. So I've been charged over the last few years with raising the funding to build a new facility at UBC, which is a facility specialized for not only cell therapies, but other types of advanced medicinal products. So products that are going in and manipulating people's DNA through in vivo gene therapy or through cellular therapy, and also through mRNA vaccination. So yesterday, it was announced that we were successful in leveraging a significant amount of funding from the federal government to build this facility at UBC. It's going to take, we don't have a building yet, so it'll be a few years, but and the exciting part is the money's not only for the building, but also for all the equipment that's going to go in it. And so this is going to bring a huge advance to the BC's research potential, economic potential, because we'll have a place where researchers can go and create the next innovations, like the round of CAR T cells that are approved now. That's just the beginning of the future, essentially. The future is genetic medicine, where you're moving away from the drug and small molecule type things to these living therapies. And we're going to have the infrastructure that allows us to do that.
And I think also the point of it also being at UBC is that it's not just the manufacturing and the machines that do that. We also need to train the next generation of people to be able to manufacture these products safely, be certified to manufacture these products safely, and build that internal personnel capacity in Canada as well to be able to implement these changes. Dr. Kandarian, I believe you have something similar set up where you are in Mayo. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, certainly. To treat our patients with CAR T, we can use the FDA-approved CAR T with the companies. So when we collect the cells from patients, we ship the cells to the company, they make the CAR Ts, and they send it back to us. And And in addition to that, we have established over the last few years an infrastructure for making CAR T manufacturing CAR T in-house at Mayo Clinic, similar to what Dr. Livings was referring to. So here we are making CAR Ts directly that are made in our lab, and then we established a manufacturing process for the CAR Ts at Mayo, and we make CAR Ts at home at Mayo. So that would allow us to deliver CAR Ts to patients in a faster way. So instead of shipping it to the company, having all the processes and the release done at the company and shipped back, that process takes anywhere between 3 and 6 weeks. When we do it at home, it takes us 6 to 10 days to get it back to patients. And also it allows us to do it at a fraction of the cost that would cost us to buy the FDA approved product. As you may know, in the United States, the FDA approved product are anywhere between 400 and 500,000 for the cost of the product. So making it in-house allows us to make that at a much affordable way. But right now it's still at a lower scale because it's in the context of clinical trial. So how can we scale this up is a task that we need to figure out over the next few years. We have a proposal and we have ideas that we've put together within the society to the FDA and bringing different players in, is how can we manufacture it at a larger scale, and we're allowed to deliver this to patients routinely, not just on a clinical trial. But having such an infrastructure in-house, I think if this becomes a process that we're able to scale up, would increase access to CAR T cell therapy. Similar to the points that were just raised by Dr. Michaels and others on this panel, the CAR T is a complex process. It's a complex supply chain process. It has unique toxicities, so it needs to be delivered in a tertiary center that's able to manage these toxicities. It needs the trained physicians that are able to deal with these toxicities, and you need to have the whole spectrum of the infrastructure, the lab, the release criteria. It needs to be done at centers that do bone marrow transplantation. So because of this complexity, a few months ago, I was reading that in the United States, and the CAR T has been approved since 2017, only 20% of patients who are eligible to get CAR T are actually able to get it, because they are unable to travel to the center, they don't have the right insurance, they don't have the right knowledge and awareness. So, we need efforts to increase access, to simplify the process a bit. And I think one of the strategies to increase the access is one of the few strategies is to enable manufacturing CAR T within the academic centers to get it in a faster way and in a more affordable way.
Yes, that's a good point, and not one that everyone knows, is that because these are individualized treatments, they are extremely expensive. And so, especially in the States where you have certain insurance providers, etc., luckily in Canada we have our public healthcare system, but there's still that patient access issue, especially in terms of thinking of the rural population where may not be, even an academic center that would be close by. So what are some ways that we can increase some patient access? Dr. Song, do you have any ideas? Hand waving?
Well, Canada's a big country. Our population is not that big, but we do have a lot of people who are very far away. I mean, British Columbia is in one corner of the province, and we have patients all over the province. So it's an issue that we've been dealing with, as any specialty program located in Vancouver has been dealing with, similar to the Children's Hospital, where people have to locate to Vancouver. So, we have social workers involved who try to bring these patients down or help them in terms of other programs or other resources that they can. And the other thing is that specifically for CAR T cells, the company also has a program which helps with travel costs and with accommodations. Of course, they don't cover everything, but they do, help with some of the financial burdens. So we do have infrastructure to help these people come down because we do want people to have these treatments. As Dr. Kandarian mentioned, one of the challenges is that this is not a pill that you can just go to your local pharmacy and get. So, there has to be a certain degree of commitment from the patients to come down, and that's unfortunately a reality of the situation. In the future, of course, as we do try to spread this treatment to other institutions, our hope is that there will maybe, for instance, institutions like on Vancouver Island or in the interior that may eventually be able to deliver these treatments, and that's where I think that we're going to try to increase access. But given the infrastructure needs, that's not going to happen in the immediate future, but perhaps a bit more in the distant future.
Great, thanks.
I
Dr.
have a couple of
Kandiri,
points
oh yeah,
to add
yeah, of
access,
course.
if you don't mind.
Yeah, of
I do
course.
think there's a few points there that I just want to expand upon a little bit. There's the initial financial barrier, and as Dr. Kandarian said, these are very, very expensive treatments, and we also have to think back to the time when decisions were being made by Health Canada and the Canadian Drug Agency providing recommendations of whether provinces should be funding this or market authorization should be granted. This is back in 2017 when Kimray and Yescarta first came online. And it's a similar situation in how many CAR Ts were first introduced. The data is a lot less mature at that time point than we're learning that it is now. So if from the perspective of the payer, the public health system, you're having to front a cost that is substantially more for a one-time treatment. And it's fantastic that it is a one-time treatment because that's better for the patient and it's better for the healthcare system at large. But that still means that the public system has to accommodate a one-time payment for what we knew about the data at the time, which was a 6-month follow-up or a year follow-up within the clinical trial. So there's a certain magnitude of risk that a lot of funders weren't necessarily comfortable with right at the beginning because you're not seeing that patient benefit till years and years later. Now that we're in a situation where the new technology has matured a substantial amount, we have follow-up data 5 years, 7 years, 8 years down the road, you begin to establish a little bit more certainty around what's being used now. So that does allow the infrastructure to evolve because there's a little bit more trust within the treatment itself and how it's actually going to play out for patients. So that's one part of patient access. And then another part of the evolution of data, and as we get to know more about something that's new, is you gain more comfortability with the treatment process itself and what then becomes possible in terms of introducing additional efficiencies into these different systems. And as Dr. Song alluded to, what we might be able to see in the future is a process that is broken up around the province, and there could be more outpatient type of care when managing the patients after the treatment. That's not a realm I'm going to go too much into because I don't have a clinical background, but that's just to say that as the technology evolves and more data comes in and the more you know, there's additional things that you can do to increase patient access and in terms of efficiency and data infrastructure that's already in place.
Yeah, this is definitely a new frontier, and so it's nice to just imagine what the future could look like, especially for these precision medicines. I know you touched on it before. Oh, sorry, of course, Dr. Levings.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up on access. I think the future is also using so-called off-the-shelf products where they're not manufactured from the patient themselves. None of those are approved yet, but it's definitely on the horizon. And for the regulatory cell therapy that we're working on, that's our vision, to have an off-the-shelf product that is available whenever you want in a frozen format that would be much more easily accessible for people across the country. And then the other evolution in the technology is in vivo generation of CAR T cells. So rather than taking cells out, engineering them in the lab and all the complexities around that, technology is now allowing that genetic engineering to be done in the patient themselves, giving them either through a viral vector or like a lipid nanoparticle mRNA type approach, doing the engineering in the patient. And that was also really going to increase access. So I think probably in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see an evolution of the whole approach to generating these cells.
That's a really great point. There's a lot in the future, especially regarding the allogenic, so things that don't have to be specified to the specific individual, and also the in vivo editing. That's a great point. I know, Dr. Michaels, you touched on this a bit earlier, but can we discuss a little bit more about the regulatory, let's say, challenges around these new therapies, just because compared to what traditionally gets through the FDA or Health Canada, they're, the typical drugs, small biologics, and this is kind of a whole new ball game, let's say, for these products. Could you elaborate a little bit on what that looks like?
Sure. So when you're dealing with a transformative therapy like a gene therapy or a drug for a rare disease or an immunotherapy where you're working in a space with relatively small patient populations or where there's significant unmet clinical need. So the clinical trials just look different. So if you think of small molecules where you can have a proper randomized control trial with your treatment arm and a solid comparator arm, that's the kind of evidence that Health Canada and Canadian Drug Agency and jurisdictions like to see in terms of determining cause and effect and really if something works or not. But when you're working in the space of rare disease or a transformative therapy, oftentimes it's not possible, or it might even be unethical to not provide treatment in a comparator arm. So you're getting evidence at the regulatory level and the health technology assessment level that may be a single arm trial, phase 2, what they call less mature type data, which is harder to make decisions on. And the follow-up period of understanding the longevity of that clinical effect may also be significantly shorter compared to what is potentially possible with a one-time treatment. So that's saying that you get this therapy at one time. It's supposed to be able to work 10 years down the road, 15 years down the road, compared to something where you're continuously administering it. So that creates additional uncertainty around the data. And then you have to rely later on how it actually performs in the real world to kind of fill in those data gaps and rely on the additional clinical trials that drug sponsors do to fill in those gaps. And what we're seeing in the US and the UK, different parts around the world, and now in Canada, is a regulatory system that is adapting to be able to accommodate those varying levels of evidence. So Health Canada has had what they call a notice of compliance with conditions since 2018, 16, something like that. It's been around for a little while, but the Canadian Drug Agency now has a process called time-limited recommendations that will provide the technology assessment support that route of approval needs. And then similarly with the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, which is called the Temporary Access Program, is making decisions and reimbursement and negotiation decisions for time-limited periods. So with products that are coming through with less mature evidence, saying this is the data that you have now, we will fund it for a temporary amount of time, allowing patients to have access under the conditions that the manufacturer continues to collect additional data, and then a follow-up decision can be made a certain amount of years down the road. And if the data held up, if the data gaps that were identified were filled, to the satisfaction of the jurisdictions and the folks at the Canadian Drug Agency and PCPA, then it will continue to be funded. If additional data is then also required at that point, I'm sure additional decisions will be made. But those are the kind of changes that we're seeing in regulatory and health technology assessment bodies all over the world that Canada is now adopting to.
Great, thanks. Because it's not specific to CAR T, but it's also for all of these innovative new genetic therapies. So gene therapy. I know that Genome BC funds a project doing real-world healthcare assessment. So trying to find a different approach to evaluating these technologies. Dr. Kandarian, from your perspective in the States or internationally, how has the uptake of CAR T been? Has there been a lot of pushback, or has there been general excitement?
So I think generally there is excitement for CAR T. We're seeing the efficacy, and in addition to the efficacy, it's moving up the line. So, in lymphoma, it started as a third line therapy, and then there was a randomized trial comparing it to transplant, and now it's a second line therapy in most cases. Same thing in multiple myeloma. It started as a fifth line therapy, and earlier this year we have the two products. One of them is approved for third line therapy. One is second line based on clinical trials that are showing efficacy as you move it earlier on in the therapy. Um, I think there are, some like what you've alluded to, there are other forms of immune therapy similar to CAR T. There is the bispecific antibodies, for example, that are off the shelf. That is always viewed as another way to stimulate the immune system, but these are an antibody therapy. But unlike CAR T cell therapy, the bispecific therapy, the bispecific engagers is something that the patients will need to take continuously. It stimulates the immune system somewhat similar to CAR T, but it requires continuous taking of this infusion, and we haven't seen similarly high rates of durable complete remissions after therapy. Um, so generally speaking, there is excitement. We have the real world data like what you referenced from the United States, and the real world data across multiple centers seems to be comparable to the pivotal clinical trials that led to the FDA approval of CAR T cell therapy.
Well, it's good that the regulatory systems such as the FDA and Health Canada are now adapting then to try to think of new ways to assess these safely, but still be able to get these therapies to patients sooner. So I think we have time for one more question before we get to the Q&A. So these innovations such as CAR T or the utilization of CRISPR have revolutionized approaches to precision medicine. So what is on the horizon in the future in terms of what's next for cellular therapies? Dr. Levings, do you want to start?
Sure. So I mentioned a little bit of the future. I'm on the ground doing wet lab research, so that's what we're thinking about all the time. So taking this to an off-the-shelf product with allogeneic cells, so not from the patient themselves, I think is a very near future. The in vivo editing is probably a bit further away. What I'm super excited about is the expansion of the cell therapies into different diseases beyond cancer. I mentioned the transformative results in autoimmunity that were actually rather unexpected because people had tried to eliminate the autoimmune causing B cells in lupus patients using traditional antibody therapies, and they had only been sort of partially effective. And so not only are the CAR T cell therapies apparently significantly more effective, they're also teaching us more about the biology of the disease, because it's a new understanding of how the B cells are involved and what specific types of cells are causing autoimmune diseases. So there's also that context. When we go in with these living therapies, we discover new disease biology that we didn't understand at all before. And then with that new information, you can create other new therapies that may or may not be cell-based therapies, could lead to discoveries of how to use more traditional type pharmacological therapy more effectively in different diseases. So it's just revolutionized the way we can think about how to intervene and also harness the body's own natural immune system in many different ways.
Who wants to go next? Volunteers. Okay, I'll call on you. Go ahead, Dr. Kandarian. Or sorry, was that Dr. Kandarian? It's hard to see, sorry.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I agree with Dr. Levings. I think the field is just starting. I think we're going to see several new iterations of CAR T. We're going to see CAR Ts that are safer, that can be given effectively as an outpatient. We'll see CAR Ts that are more effective, that can work for solid tumors. Similarly in my lab, we keep thinking about ways to improve on CAR T cells and make them tackle solid tumors. They are successful in blood cancers, but even in blood cancers, these remarkable remissions, they are achieved in anywhere between 30 and 60% of patients, depending on the disease and the situation. But the other patients relapse. So we need to figure out what's causing the CAR T resistance. It's within the tumor microenvironment, what's inhibiting CAR T. And we're learning more and more from blood cancers, and we're going to apply this knowledge on figuring out how to engineer the CAR T cells better to make them more effective for the treatment of solid tumor. We're excited about the autoimmune disease space, and I agree the lupus results were quite unexpected to have such durable remissions with CAR T, and we'll learn from that. We're seeing other cells, that regulatory T cells for autoimmune diseases. We recently have worked with mesenchymal stromal cells to engineer them for autoimmune diseases. We're seeing macrophages and engineered macrophages for cancers. And we're seeing strategies to make the CAR T cells more accessible with off the shelf. And the in vivo off the shelf is advanced. The results so far have been quite inferior to the autologous CAR T. Understandably, there is the rejection, there is the graft versus host disease, but there are advances in synthetic biology, there is advances in ways that we engineer the cells, and we're going to figure out how to engineer the cells effectively, that they are still effective. There's the CAR T cells if they are off the shelf, that they are still effective if you engineer their T cell receptors, their HLA molecule, that they continue to work well, and that certainly will increase access, and we'll see more and more of this. So, I think when I see CAR T cell in general or cell therapy, I see it in three areas of limitations: that they're toxicities, and we're figuring out ways how to make it more safer and to be delivered in an outpatient setup. We're seeing problems with efficacy, and also we're figuring out what's inhibiting CAR T cells and how we can extend it into other cancers and into non-cancer space. And then the access, and we continue to make advances in both the off-the-shelf, the CAR Ts that are made at the institution, and for in vivo CAR Ts and cell therapies.
Regarding the CAR T cell toxicity, is that typically just from the cytokine release syndrome, or is it due to other factors? And how, because we know that chemotherapy is also relatively toxic as well in terms of also damaging healthy cells. So how did those compare in terms of, comparing those two different
Toxicity.
treatments?
Yeah, certainly. So cytokine release syndrome is one of the main toxicities after CAR T cell therapy, and that relates that the CAR Ts are expanding in patients and they are killing cancer cells. But another unique toxicity that happens after cytokine release syndrome is the neurotoxicity, where patients can get confused, they can go into transient coma. Most of the cases, it's reversible. We don't fully understand it. We know that there are some components in the mechanism of neurotoxicity, and we don't have really very effective treatment for neurotoxicity. We have effective treatment to stop cytokine release syndrome and reverse it. We have some treatments, which is steroids, that could help maybe with neurotoxicity, but it's not clear. Now, luckily, both cytokine release syndrome and neurotoxicity are reversible within the first 2 to 4 weeks. In 95% of the cases are fully reversible. So luckily, these toxicities tend to be in the acute phase in the first 2 to 4 weeks after CAR T cell therapy, and that's where we need to monitor patients, and they need to stay close to the institution where CAR T is delivered. Another unique toxicity with CAR T is that it can cause a prolonged cytopenia, suppression of the bone marrow, and low blood counts. That can last in up one third of patients can last beyond 1 month. These are some of the unique toxicities, but definitely compared to chemotherapy, the toxicities are more in the first few weeks and more manageable and tend to be reversible in the vast majority of cases.
Interesting, thank you. Dr. Song, do you have anything to elaborate in terms of comparing CAR T to chemotherapy in your opinion?
I think it's like Dr. Kandarian mentioned. It has to be done typically in a unit that's comfortable with doing bone marrow or hematopoietic stem cell transplants, because the toxicities are somewhat similar, but they are unique. And as Dr. Kandaran also mentioned, you have these cytokine release syndromes, but they do have these neurological toxicities that can be somewhat atypical and challenging to manage. But importantly, you have to have the expertise of the physician and the medical and the nursing staff to be able to deal with these patients and to recognize what to do with this. So I think that's a huge part of trying to build the infrastructure is actually the human resource of the knowledge that needs to be done to be able to do this. And so this is one of the challenges of how we're trying to scale up to allow patients in British Columbia to get this treatment. I do just want to just make a little bit of a comment about where the future is also headed, because one of the other things that you're having discussed in this forum is also the issue of hereditary disorders, for instance, sickle cell and thalassemia. And I think that that's also an area that will develop quite a bit in the future in terms of how cellular therapy may actually be able to help in patients who have hereditary disorders. And I think that's an interesting area to watch as well.
Yeah, I have a specific interest in rare disease, so I think it would be really interesting when we start to see those applications come out. Dr. Michaels, do you have any final thoughts as we head to the future of CAR T therapy?
Yeah, I think it's just a very exciting time to be in this area, to see the really, really large scale benefits that this can have for patients, and to really be at a time when we're able to address the root causes of a disease and offer one-time treatments that have a lot of longevity. I think that's fantastic from the patient perspective, from the healthcare system perspective, especially when we think about sickle cell disease and hemophilia and beta thalassemia. Treatments that prior to gene therapies being available required constant transfusions and a lot of hospital time. The magnitude of benefit that we can potentially see with gene therapies, I don't think can be understated. And I'm curious and very excited to see what it does for the healthcare system at large. That removes a lot of resources and times and adds a lot of benefit to patient lives. And maybe we'll see somewhere in the future where, because there's less strain and resources being required from the healthcare system, because we can kind of displace them with a one-time therapy, that could free up some resources and help with some other challenges as well.
Great, thank you. So let's now take questions from the audience. I want to remind our audience to ask your question using the Slido panel on the side of your screen. So first, here's the first question for our audience. Now this is a bit of a let's say a crystal ball question, but if today we were to commit 100% to training, infrastructure, etc., to incorporate this into standard of care, when would this be routine? Like, this is routine, just, oh, I'm going just to the doctor's office to get my CAR T.
I guess I could take the first stab at it and then pass it on to others, because this is what we've been planning and trying to do over the past couple of years. It's not an easy question to answer, partially because, as was mentioned by Dr. Michaels, is that, at this time point, we have certain therapies for certain indications that are approved. But this is going to change, meaning that over the next couple of years, we'll have more indications, more different CAR T cells. So, in fact, the population that requires this treatment is actually going to expand because of the advances that we're making. So we're constantly trying to keep up with the technology, with the advances, and try our best to be as close as possible to the needs of the population. Currently in British Columbia, for instance, we've started standard of care CAR T cells over the past couple of months, and we're gradually but rapidly trying to ramp up. But we still have needs that outstrip our capacity. So some people still do have to go out of province. In the next year or two, hopefully we can capture all of those patients. But by that point, we'll have newer challenges of newer indications and newer CAR T cells that we are going to have to administer. So this is where it's hard to answer, because once again, this goes to, we need physical space for these people. We need, as Dr. Kandarian mentioned, places where they can get their cells collected, like the apheresis units. We need places where after treatment in hospital, they'll be followed closely. We'll have to also have people who are going to be able to follow these patients once they go home, because we need to know what happens to them after a month or two, et cetera. So, so this is going to be a continuous process. And I think it's really an example of how the field continues to advance and will not remain static.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and we mentioned it earlier that there's going to be new technologies. So as soon as we get the infrastructure built for this one, then we'll go to allogenic or we'll go to in vivo, and then we have to adapt again. So I think as long as we remain agile, there's lots of hope for the future. A similar question for Dr. Levings: how long do you think till we see therapies in the clinic for autoimmune disease, given the promise? Again, get your crystal ball out and give it a shot. Oh, you're on mute again, I think. Or we'll get the Samaya to work on getting you back up, but maybe I'll just go to a different question till we can hear you. So let's see. There is some, I think, some indications that the next steps will be in solid tumors, and so I'm really interested in terms of, what do you think is like the first solid tumor, or can we even guess like which ones have the most promise? I think it was mentioned that prostate maybe earlier for solid tumors. Dr. Kandarian, do you want to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it's more complex, like Dr. Song mentioned, and we've seen we've seen reports with patients where they go, for example, with a glioblastoma. There was a report a few years ago of a patient that went in complete remission following CAR T cell therapy. Again, this is unheard of, but to have a complete remission in glioblastoma brain cancer, but the response was short-lived, and also these are few patients here and there. But we're learning that there is efficacy of CAR T cell, that there is potential, that there are patients that have a significant response. But I think we need to make a better iteration, a more resistant CAR T than the current platform we have. The data that we have some data encouraging in brain cancer. There were a few CAR Ts that are either target single antigen or dual antigen that have some responses. There's data from in gastric cancer for CAR Ts that target Claudin 18.2, that the data were encouraging, that a significant percentage of patients had some response. But we're not seeing yet the remarkable responses that we see in blood cancers.
In complete remission. Some have higher toxicities, and I wonder how much of the genetic background we heard from Dr. David Altshuler earlier about how traits are multigenic and people are complex, and so I wonder if there's been some research into the the genetic background of an individual patient and how much that affects whether they'll respond to CAR T or not. Anyone have an idea, or I'm just more hand waving? Dr. Levings, are you back on? Oh, okay, no problem. Sorry, did anyone want to add to that? All right. So let's look at another question. I was curious, especially for the BC program in CAR T. We know that it's only approved for a few blood cancers. Which patients become eligible? Are there patients that have already gone through a bunch of therapies and nothing's working? They've already done a bone marrow transplant and it didn't work. Could you comment at all in terms of, how we prioritize one patient over another? It's awful to say, but, which one will have the most effect in certain patients? Dr. Song, can you elaborate on that?
So I think it goes back to one of the comments that Dr. Kandarian mentioned. When treatments are first developed, they're typically used in people who have very limited or no options left. And so the first approval for CAR T cells in lymphoma and in acute lymphoblastic lymphoma were pretty much people who were in that situation where they didn't have any treatment that was available to them. But as we begin to understand the treatment and understand that it works, the trials then move more to the earlier lines of treatment. For instance, with lymphoma, it was previously third line therapies, and now it's gone to second line. And so I think in the United States, it's being given second line. In Canada, right now, it's not being given second line. And that's because although Health Canada has approved it for second line, the governments, meaning the provincial governments, have to come to the point to where they have entered in negotiations with the companies and then approve the funding locally. And so we expect that will happen soon. So in British Columbia, we try to follow all those indications such that, the British Columbians get the exact same access that they would to this treatment as anybody else in Canada would. The difference is that, there are some provinces that have a bit more capacity than others, and the province that has the most capacity is Ontario, just by the size of its population and the fact that it has many centers. So at this point, there are still British Columbians that will have to go to Ontario for some treatments because we are trying to build capacity such that we can repatriate all these patients eventually. But it does take us time, and it's not just because we're, as previously mentioned, giving pills, but it's because we need to actually have the process set down. We have to have the infrastructure that gradually builds, because one of the things that we don't want to do is to try to do everything at once, because when mistakes get made, what it does is that it shuts down programs and then you have to go back to square one. We don't want that to happen. We want to perfect it such that we can actually meet the needs, but also deliver proper care. So I think the short answer to your question is British Columbians will get the same thing that other Canadians will. It's just a question of will it be in British Columbia or in other provinces. And hopefully in the near future, all British Columbians will get their treatments in BC.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. I had a friend pass away earlier this year of leukemia, so I'm really excited that this CAR T therapy is now approved for hematological cancers. Dr. Levings, I believe you're back now, so I think this is time for one more
hopefully.
audience question. I can hear you. Yep, that's great.
Okay. Yeah, sorry everyone. It was the emergency notification that completely wrapped with my audio.
Well, hopefully it's not too big of an emergency and everything's all right. But let's just get to the final audience question. Yeah. Okay. So we'll thank the government for that. Good job, Michael. Yeah. So how long do you think we'll see these therapies for autoimmune disease? Like you said, it's a very early indication for autoimmune disease.
Yeah. So it's very early.
Yeah.
But, I was just reading a paper yesterday that there's 64 registered clinical trials right now using CAR T cells for autoimmunity, for lupus, multiple sclerosis, myasthenia gravis. So it's going to go really fast. And I mean, the great news is that we already have the product rolled out it's the same product that Dr. Song's using for his patients. So if those clinical trials confirm the initial success, I think it's going to be a very short timeline to having that as a feasible therapy for particular autoimmune diseases. And then Dr. Song is going to be needing even more resources because, if this therapy has applications in autoimmune disease and as a very large patient population that could benefit. So we need to keep pushing for more capacity building, more training, and all the wraparound support that we've been talking about.
Well, and it's great that the Canada Immunoengineering Hub grant that you received is part of that capacity building. I think after the pandemic, the federal government noticed how Canada was a bit behind in terms of being able to do our own things at home. And so there's been a large injection of funding into building that capacity, and hopefully that capacity will domino into the implementation of these other technologies. So I think this has been a wonderful discussion, has brought me hope into what the future holds for BC patients with these innovative new technologies. I'd like to thank my panelists, Dr. Kandarian, Dr. Levings, Dr. Song, and Dr. Michaels for your time and input on this thoughtful discussion today. This concludes our session, and we hope you've enjoyed this conversation. Please join us for our next session, Beyond Borders, Engineering Solutions in Combating Complex and Common Diseases, which starts at 11:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time.